The Enchantress Returns, Chapter 29, For Better or for Worse. All the kings and queens left the charming kingdom the following day to celebrate the news of the Enchantress's defeat with their people. Red was the only one who stayed behind, because at the end of the week, she, Froggy, Goldilocks, Jack, Bob, Charlotte, and the twins all attended Rumpelstiltskin's funeral. Hearing the news of his final act and what his last words had been was hard for the seven dwarfs to swallow, so they wanted to make sure the ceremony was everything Rumpelstiltskin would have wanted. It was a small ceremony in the dwarf forest on the front lawn of the seven dwarfs' cottage. The dwarfs had made their brother a casket of glass and jewels from their mines, just as they had for Snow White. He was buried in a daisy-covered field not too far from the cottage. The dwarfs and Rumpelstiltskin had spent a lot of time there when he was younger, and they knew he would have been happy to make it his final place of rest. His tombstone even read, "Here lies Rumpelstiltskin, the eighth brother of a proud dwarf family." That night when they arrived back at the charming kingdom, King Chance and Queen Cinderella hosted a dinner to honor the twins and the others who had sailed on the Granny. Connor was seated at the table in the dining hall when a man sat next to him and started up a conversation. "I'm looking forward to this," the man said. "I miss being a part of the famous charming dinner parties." "Do I know you?" Connor asked him and gave the man the side eye. "Connor, it's me," the man said. "It's Froggy." Connor shook his head and looked at the man again. He always forgot Froggy was actually human, but no matter what physical form he took, he always had the same kind eyes. "Your grandmother changed me back as soon as we returned from the funeral," Froggy said. "The funny thing is, I have grown so accustomed to being a frog, I had forgotten she still had to change me back." "Do you miss anything about being a frog?" Connor asked him. "I do miss reaching the books on the top of the shelf without a ladder," he said. "One doesn't realize how useful frog legs can be until they lose them." A twinkle came to Froggy's eyes. "Speaking of reading, I have something for you." He reached into his lapel and pulled out a rolled-up stack of parchments. "When we were setting up for the camps for the trolls, I found this in the Granny's wreckage," Froggy said, and handed the parchments over to Connor. "My stories!" Connor said. "I thought these were lost forever." "I must admit, I enjoyed them quite a bit," Froggy said. "You got a real knack for storytelling, although I do have a few words of advice for you." "What's that?" Connor asked. "Never let Red read these," Froggy said. "I thought it was very clever, writing everyone as trolls, but she would have you executed if she read your interpretation of her." Connor chuckled and playfully punched Froggy's shoulder. "No, I'm serious," Froggy said. Connor gulped. The others finally arrived and took seats around the table. Jack and Goldilocks looked down timidly at all of the silverware, not knowing where to start. Red entered the room and almost blinded everyone with the amount of jewelry she was wearing. Even for a formal dinner in the charming palace, Red was overdressed. Bob sat down across from Connor, looking unusually tense. "What's wrong, Bob?" Connor said. "You look like you're about to operate on the president." Alex cleared her throat to get Connor's attention. "He's going to propose to Mom tonight," Alex mouthed when her mother wasn't looking. "Oh." Connor mouthed back excitedly to Bob and his sister. He gave Bob an unsubtle wink and a thumbs up. "Is everything all right, Connor?" Charlotte asked. Yes," Connor said. "I'm just really looking forward to the appetizers." Alex rolled her eyes at him. Charlotte studied her son suspiciously, afraid he was coming down with a cold. A footman presented a tray to Goldilocks with an envelope addressed to her on it. "A letter has come for you, madame," the footman said. "For me?" Goldilocks said. "I wonder what it could be." She opened the envelope and read the note inside. An amused but shocked grin came to her face. She wasn't sure how to feel about the news she received. "What is it?" Jack asked her. "It's a note from the Red Riding Hood Castle stables," Goldilocks said. "Porridge is pregnant." Jack and the twins couldn't contain themselves, each one laughing harder than the next. "Buckle!" the twins said together. "I knew there was something going on between them," Connor said. The dinner began and the room was served course after course of the best food the twins had ever eaten. Just before the desserts were brought out, Bob tapped the side of his glass with a spoon and got the room's attention. Alex and Connor shot excited looks at each other. This was it. "I just want to thank you all so much for having me tonight," Bob said. "I'm fairly new to the Bailey clan, so learning about all of you and coming into this world has been, well, the adventure of my life." And seeing that I happen to be in a room filled with people who make up the greatest love stories ever told, I would like to take this moment for all it's worth." Charlotte looked back and forth between the twins, seeing if they knew what Bob was up to. They purposely avoided her eyes, wanting Bob to surprise her fully. He got down on one knee and presented the ring to her. "Charlotte, will you make me the happiest man in the world, both worlds, and be my wife?" Bob said. Tears instantly filled Charlotte's surprised eyes. I, I, she said. Everyone in the dining hall was on the edge of their seat. "Yes, I would love nothing more." Bob put the ring on Charlotte's finger and hugged her. Alex began to cry, which made Connor's eyes start to water, which ultimately caused everyone else in the room to well up too. It was a picturesque moment, even by fairy tale standards. "You should get married in the palace," Cinderella said from the end of the table. "What?" Charlotte asked, not believing her ears. "Please, we insist," Cinderella said, and took King Chance's hand in hers. "We've been trying to think of a way to thank you for taking care of Hope when you were being held by the Enchantress. It'd be our pleasure." Charlotte didn't know what to say. She was stunned by the offer. "That is so kind, but I'm not sure I could ever—" "Mom," Alex interrupted her, "speaking on behalf of every woman who has ever lived in the other world, you cannot turn down the offer to have an actual fairy tale wedding." "I have to agree, it would be pretty cool," Connor said. Charlotte shrugged. The decision was basically made for her. "Well, all right then. I would be honored. Thank you," she said. "We have to get back to our jobs in the other world, but I suppose we can take a quick wedding with our friends here and then another for our friends back home." Everyone raised their glasses to toast Charlotte and Bob. "May you live happily ever after," the fairy godmother said. Red tapped her glass and stood at her seat. No one could look directly at her because of the light reflecting off of her diamonds. "I would like to add to the celebration with some wonderful news of my own," she said. "After speaking with the fairies and all the other kings and queens, I'd like to announce that the Happily Ever After Assembly has decided to pardon Jack and Goldilocks for all their crimes and waive all the warrants for their arrest as a thank you for their daring and valiant efforts in defeating the Enchantress." The room burst into applause and congratulations for the couple. However, Jack and Goldilocks looked the least excited out of all of them. "Wonderful," Goldilocks said through a pained smile. "Cheers," Jack said, reluctantly raising his glass to the others, toasting them. "You can move back into your old house, Jack," Red said, "which is going to be really convenient because I've decided to build my country home right beside it." Jack and Goldilocks did their best to look as if this was good news, and it excited them. Red went on and on about all the wonderful double dates they could have with her and Froggy, and all the activities they would do now they were going to be neighbors. Goldilocks leaned towards Jack. "Well, at least I won't have to feel guilty about making you live the life of an outlaw anymore," she said. "No more running from soldiers, or close encounters with ogres, or sneaking into shops to steal food, or sleeping under the stars in dangerous forests," Jack said. "It's tempting to live a quieter life," Goldilocks said half-heartedly. "Just imagine us living the rest of our days in your manor, watching the grass grow with Red and Charlie." Jack and Goldilocks smirked at each other, both thinking the same thing. They couldn't imagine a worse fate. Goldilocks whispered something into Jack's ear, and a big grin appeared on his face. The twins looked to each other, knowing something was up. Goldilocks stood from the table and walked over to Red. She endearingly wrapped her arms around her old nemesis and gave her a big hug. "What's all this about?" Red asked. "I just want to thank you," Goldilocks said. "What you've done for us is so generous. We'll never be able to repay you." Red looked like she was about to cry. "You're welcome," Red said, "and even though we both tried to kill each other, I tricked you into going into a house with 3 furious bears. You tried to throw me into a bottomless pit. I would like it very much if we put the past aside and let our friendship bloom even more." Goldilocks smiled at her. "I think that's a wonderful idea, Red," she said. "Now if you'll excuse me, I'm going to step out for a moment." Goldilocks gave Red another hug and excused herself from the dining room. The dessert was finally served, and Connor looked up and down the table to make sure his piece of cake wasn't any smaller than the rest of theirs. "Hey, that's not fair. Red got 2 pieces of—" Connor stopped himself mid-complaint. Something was different. He was looking at Red without squinting. "Hey, Red, where's your necklace?" "My necklace?" Red asked. She reached up to her neck and screamed when she discovered her diamond necklace was missing. "That doesn't make any sense. How could it have possibly vanished?" "Goldilocks!" Both the twins turned to Jack. He wiped his mouth with his napkin, trying to hide a giant grin underneath it. Sir Lambton suddenly rushed into the dining room. He had built a reputation of constantly bringing such awful news in the last few days. The entire room went silent to hear what he had to say. "Yes, Sir Lambton?" King Chance asked. "Pardon my intrusion, your majesty," Lambton said. "With all due respect, did you give Goldilocks permission to take one of the horses from the stable, or has one just been stolen?" Everyone's eyes immediately darted to Jack. "Well, that's my cue," he said, and stood up from the table. "Alex and Connor, it was wonderful to see you again, and I thank everyone else for a lovely evening and a wonderful dinner. Good night." With that said, Jack ran down to the dining hall and jumped out of the closest window. Red leaped up from the table and ran over to the window. Froggy and the twins followed her and peered through it. They arrived just in time to see Jack sliding down the slanted roof and landed perfectly on the back of a horse that Goldilocks held the reins of on the ground. They both waved up at Red, Froggy, and the twins. Red's necklace sparkled in the moonlight on Goldilocks' neck. "That's my necklace!" Red yelled. "Bring that back to me at once!" Goldilocks yanked on the reins, and she and Jack rode off into the night, happy outlaws once again. Red slammed her hands on the windowsill. "I cannot believe I wasted an ounce of generosity on that woman!" she yelled. "Sir Lambton, I want you to put a team of your finest men together and go after her at once." "But I don't work for you," Lambton said. "No excuses, Lambton. Find them!" Red demanded. Lambton looked to King Chance and Cinderella. They both shrugged. "Right away, Queen Red," Lambton said with a sigh and left the room. Alex, Connor, and Froggy couldn't help but laugh as they watched their friends ride off into the night. Much as it distressed Red, they were happy to see Goldilocks and Jack return to their own habitat. Charlotte and Bob's wedding was just 2 days later. The entire palace was decorated in flowers and giant banners. Bells rang through the entire kingdom. In charming tradition, the twins' grandmother transformed their mother's nursing scrubs into a beautiful white gown and veil. Alex and Connor have never seen her look so beautiful, and both grew a little misty-eyed because of it. They were so happy to see their mom get the wedding she deserved. The ceremony was held in the ballroom, and it was so crowded the twins thought the entire charming kingdom might have shown up. The fairy godmother conducted the ceremony herself. Princess Hope was led down the aisle by her mother and acted as a flower girl. Connor was Bob's best man, and Alex had her mother's maid of honor. "Do you, Charlotte, take this man to be your husband?" the fairy godmother asked. "I do," Charlotte said. "And do you, Robert, take this woman to be your wife?" "I do," Bob said. The vows were only interrupted once, as Red loudly blew her nose from the seats, overcome by the ceremony and still upset at losing her favorite necklace. "By the power invested in me by the happily ever after assembly, I now pronounce you husband and wife," the fairy godmother happily called out. "You may now kiss the bride." The twins both turned their heads the other way, and the crowd cheered. Bob, Charlotte, and the twins then got into a carriage in the shape of a pumpkin and rode through the charming kingdom streets, waving to all the well-wishers who had gathered there. "I think this family is off to a good start," Connor said. That evening, as soon as all of the festivities were over, the fairy council met the fairy godmother at the charming palace. They were there on official council business and called together a meeting so exclusive no one but the fairies was allowed to be a part of it. The fairy godmother waved her wand and made a door appear that led into the other world, and she and the other fairies waited for Mother Goose to arrive so the meeting could start. Mother Goose eventually emerged through the door, dragging her basket of a suitcase and a very defiant and reluctant Lester with her. "Come on, Lester," she said. "I know you love the slot machines, but we can't stay in Vegas forever." If her appearance was any indication, Mother Goose had done a lot of traveling in the last week. She wore a large sombrero that said Tijuana across it, a colorful Hawaiian lei around her neck, a large I Love NY t-shirt, and wooden Dutch shoes. A foam finger from a football game was still over her hand. "Looks like you were busy, OMG, Connor said. "Hey, Sea Dog, just because you and your sister saved the world doesn't mean you get to be sassy," Mother Goose snapped at him. "I was afraid the Enchantress was going to cross into the other world, so I went to all my favorite places before she could destroy them." Alex looked over her worldly outfit. "I see you went to Mexico, New York, Hawaii, and a football game. But where are the shoes from?" she asked. "Amsterdam," Mother Goose said. "They love me over there." "I didn't know nursery rhymes were popular in Amsterdam," Connor said. "They're not," Mother Goose said.
They don't know me as Mother Goose. They have their own nickname for me when I visit.
What's that? Alex asked.
Mother Mayhem, she said.
The twins just nodded, not wanting to know any details.
All right, let's get this hen in the oven, Mother Goose said, and clapped her hands.
She followed the fairy council into a private drawing room. It's about time you showed up, Tangerina said.
Mind your beeswax, Tangy, Mother Goose said. No, I'm serious. Your bees are getting that crap all over the floor.
The fairy shut the door tightly behind them. Naturally, the twins placed their ears up to the door and tried eavesdropping as much as possible. The world is still in shambles, the twins heard Esmeralda's voice fade in and out. We're slowly clearing the eastern kingdom of all the thorn bushes and vines. The northern kingdom has finally rid itself of all the poisoned food. Esme's pillar of rock and dirt still needs to be removed, and there's one thing that we haven't discussed yet that involves you, fairy godmother. The twins looked at each other. Their curiosity consumed them whole.
I'll be right back,
Connor said. A few moments later, he returned with empty glasses from the palace kitchen. He handed one to Alex, and they placed them over the door and up to their ears. They could hear what the fairies were saying much more clearly now. You understand how difficult that will be for my family, don't you? They heard their grandmother say. We're not proposing it to be cruel. We're proposing it to be preventative, Skylene said.
If we don't do something, it'll only be a matter of time before someone else follows in the Enchantress's footsteps,
Xanthos said. In the end, it's your decision, Esmeralda said. It's your gift. You are the chosen one to be the gatekeeper. We can only tell you what we think is best for both worlds. Alex and Connor looked at each other. I understand, their grandmother said, and if it's what the rest of you think is the right thing to do, I cannot ignore that. I just don't know how I'm going to break the news to my grandchildren. You can take as much time as you need, Esmeralda said. The twins heard them start to come towards the door and ran down the hall so they wouldn't be caught listening. Their curiosity ate them alive for the rest of the day. What was the news their grandmother was going to have difficulty telling them? Why did it affect them in her ability to move between the worlds? The twins' imaginations didn't do them any favors as they thought on what the possibilities could be. Luckily, they weren't forced to suffer too long. That night, after dinner, the fairy council called everyone into the ballroom to fill them in on what they had discussed. It's going to take some time before the world can fully recover from the damage the Enchantress caused, Esmeralda said. Esmea may be gone, but the fact is, what she tried to accomplish still remains a possibility as long as the two worlds are joined. So what are you saying? Connor said. The fairy godmother closed her eyes, not wanting to see her grandchildren's faces when they heard it. For the greater good of both worlds, we have decided to close the gateway between them, Esmeralda said. Alex felt like she was being told her father was dead or her mother had been kidnapped all over again. Her stomach tightened and her heart beat at a rapid pace. She felt her palms go clammy and the rest of her body go numb. What? She asked, breathlessly.
How is that even possible?
Connor asked. He also was having an incredibly hard time processing the news. It's possible if we use our magic together, their grandmother regretfully told them.
So what does that mean? Connor asked. Does that mean we'll never be able to see you again?
Their grandmother shook her head, happy to report one small consolation. I was able to convince the other fairies to supply us with a way to see each other, she said. She waved her wand and two long square mirrors with golden frames appeared. We'll be able to see each other using these mirrors whenever we want. We just won't be able to
travel between worlds?
Connor asked. Their grandmother closed her eyes and nodded her head. It was clearly almost as painful for her to tell them as it was for them to hear it. Alex was shaking her head profusely, and tears began running down her face. No, Grandma, Alex pleaded. Tell me it isn't true. I'm afraid so, honey, Grandma said. Alex lost it completely and buried her face into her mother's side. She cried so hard she was practically silent except for her deep gasps for air. Charlotte tried to remain strong for her kids, but she was having a hard time keeping it together herself. She knew what the news meant for them. Are you okay with this? Connor yelled. Tears spilled down from his own eyes. I hate it as much as you do, their grandma said, but to secure the safety of both worlds, we don't have another option. Connor could only get one word of his next question out. When? He said, and his voice cracked as he fought back emotion. Tomorrow, at dusk, his grandmother said. waging her own emotional battle inside. Alex couldn't stand to hear any more of it. She ran from the ballroom and headed up to the stairs to her chambers, her hands covering her face as she went. "Alex!" Charlotte called out, but it was no use. Alex shut the door to her chambers behind her and collapsed on the floor. She cried and cried for hours and hours. She had lived through the fear of losing the fairy tale world so many times, and now it was real. It was actually being taken away from her. And of all the times, her greatest fear had been realized right after she learned how much potential she had to offer this world. Right after she discovered she had a chance at being the future fairy godmother someday. Right after her uncertain future had nearly been set. It was all being taken from her. It felt like the land of stories has always been dangled in front of her and her brother like a taunting cat toy. Every time they thought they had finally grabbed a hold of it, it slipped out of their grip. She cried until her tear ducts dried up and she couldn't cry anymore. She lay on the bed and prayed there would be some way around this nightmare. A soft knock came at the door. "Alex, can I come in?" Charlotte asked from the other side. "Sure," Alex said. Charlotte walked into the room and took a seat on the bed next to her devastated daughter. "It's so unfair, Mom," Alex said. "After everything we've been through, after everything we've seen, why does this have to be taken from us, too?" Charlotte rubbed her hand gently on Alex's knee. Alex sat up and looked at her mom. She was crying almost more than Alex had been. "Why are you crying so much, Mom?" Alex asked. "You're not losing anything." Charlotte smiled. "Oh, but I am, honey," she said. "A year ago, when you and your brother first came back from this place, I knew then I had lost my little girl forever. I watched her grow sadder and sadder the more time she spent away from this place, and I knew there was nothing I could ever do to help her because her heart belongs somewhere else." "Mom, what are you talking about?" Alex asked. Charlotte put a hand on Alex's face and looked at her daughter through the tears in her eyes. "I'm saying I'm not going to let you leave the place where you belong," she said. Chapter 30. The Goodbye. Connor woke up the next morning with a mission. Before anyone else had woken, he ran down to the stables and arranged for a carriage to take him into the countryside. He kept his activities a complete secret from anyone else, fearing someone would stop him if he made his plans known. He didn't return until that evening just before dusk, and he didn't return alone. The carriage door swung open and 3 additional passengers emerged from it. Connor had brought Lady Iris, Petunia, and Rosemary back with him. After they'd spent nearly a decade suffering through constant public persecution, Connor had offered them the only chance at refuge they had ever received. And after hearing hours of Connor's descriptions, the sequestered family of women finally jumped at the chance. They were carrying as many of their belongings as they could. Lady Iris held onto the painting of her late husband, Rosemary held her favorite cooking bowl, and Petunia grasped a stack of rolled-up animal portraits under her arm. "There's this thing called culinary school that you're going to love, Rosemary," Connor was saying, further listing the perks of his dimension. "And just wait until I introduce you to Animal Planet, Petunia." Sir Lambton emerged down the front of the steps of the palace towards the carriage. "What's going on here?" he asked Connor. Connor pulled him aside so the woman couldn't hear him. "I'm taking him back to the other world with us," he said. "You're what?" Lambton said. "I explained everything to them. It took them a while to understand, but they want to leave," Connor said. "Lambton, they're miserable here. They don't gain anything by staying. If they come with us, they'll at least have a chance at starting a better life." "Why would you help them?" Lambton asked. Connor sighed and looked to the ground. "Because I'll never be able to help my sister," he said. "Alex isn't like me. She's going to be miserable the rest of her life without this place. At least if I bring Lady Iris with us, there'll be something worth looking forward to." Lambton had his reservations, but admired the boy's generosity nonetheless. "You're a good man, Connor Bailey," he said. "Everyone is gathering in the garden for the final goodbye. Please escort your guests down there." Connor nodded and led the woman around the side of the castle to the beautiful gardens. The charming garden was home to an exquisite display of yellow roses, pear trees, and a hedge labyrinth. It was a beautiful place to say a distressing goodbye. Froggy Red, King Chance, Cinderella, and Mother Goose had already gathered in the gardens. Cinderella had to do a double take as Connor approached. She hadn't been expecting to see her stepmother and stepsisters walking behind him. "Stepmother?" Cinderella called out, "Rosemary? Petunia?" Even though they knew they were headed to the palace, Lady Iris and her daughters had almost hoped they wouldn't run into her. "Hello, Cinderella," Lady Iris said. "What are you doing here?" Cinderella asked. She looked over all the belongings they carried and answered her own question. Lady Iris thought for a moment about what to tell her. "We've decided it would be best to leave the charming kingdom," she said. "I see," Cinderella said. She didn't argue with her stepmother, knowing her reasons better than anyone else. "Where are you headed?" Lady Iris hesitated to say. "The other world. If fate would have it," she said. "I think a fresh start would do the girls and me some good. We'll be able to live in a place where people won't judge us as harshly, or throw rocks at our house, or boo us when we leave it." All Cinderella could do was nod. She might have built a gate around their property, but she could never take away all the oppressions they faced on a daily basis. "What are you going to do there?" Cinderella asked. "The boy was telling me of a place called Florida that I might be interested in," Lady Iris said. "I'm going to be a chef," Rosemary said. "I'm going to do something with animals," Petunia said. "They have so many more animals in the other world than we have. There's apparently this creature called the honey badger that I hear is fascinating." Cinderella was pleased for them, but couldn't deny she was sorry to be losing the only family she had outside the king and princess. "I'm so happy for you," she said, although they knew better. "We're doing this for you too, Cinderella," Lady Iris said. "You won't have any black sheep to worry about lingering around now. You can raise Princess Hope without ever having to tell her about us, if you'd like." Cinderella nodded. "But I plan on telling Hope everything about you," she said, "especially the part about our grandmother helping a small band of courageous sailors defeat the evil enchantress who took her from us." Lady Iris hadn't expected them to remember her request. "Did they tell you I assisted?" she asked. "No, they didn't have to," Cinderella said. She pulled a ring off her finger she wore next to her wedding ring. It was her stepmother's wedding ring. "The wand it was a part of was destroyed, but I recognized the ring. Any girl would recognize her own mother's wedding ring. I figured you would want it back." Lady Iris stared down at the ring. "I don't know what to say," she said, touched by the gesture. The girl she had been so cruel to was still showing her kindness even now. "Thank you, Cinderella. You continue to grow into a much better woman than I could ever be." Cinderella smiled. She hugged her stepmother and her stepsisters for the first and final time. Red and Froggy took their leave to start their own goodbyes. "I'm going to miss you, old chap," Froggy said to Connor, and gave him a giant hug. "I'm going to miss you too," Connor said. "And just to let you know, whenever I think about you, I'm always going to remember a giant frog." Froggy chuckled. "I wouldn't have it any other way," he said. Red kissed Connor on the cheek. "You are the sweetest boy I know," she said. "Then again, I rarely socialize with anyone of a lower age or social class." "Hey, kid," Mother Goose said, and pulled Connor aside. She slipped a blue poker chip into his hand. "If you're ever in Monte Carlo, go to the roulette table in the northwest corner of the Lumiere de Astolos casino and bet this on black." She winked at him and patted him firmly on the back. "Thanks," Connor said. The fairy council arrived promptly a few moments later. They took their positions in a big half circle around the gardens to begin sealing the gateway between the worlds. "We're just waiting for the fairy godmother and the others," Esmeralda said. "If those of you leaving this world would please just take a step forward." Connor, Lady Iris, Rosemary, and Petunia all edged forward on the grass, stepping in the center of the crescent shape the council formed. "Here they come," Skylene said. Connor turned to see his grandmother, Charlotte, Bob, and his sister walking down from the palace. Bob was carrying one of the golden mirrors his grandmother had convinced the fairy council of approving securely under his arm. Connor avoided looking at his sister, knowing whatever devastated expression was on her face would make him more heartbroken than he already was. As soon as his grandmother reached the garden, she threw her arms around Connor and said a tearful goodbye. "You take good care of yourself, do you understand?" she said to him. "I love you, Grandma," Connor said. "I love you, my darling boy," she said, and wiped the tears off of her face. "I'm going to talk to you every Sunday evening through the mirror. I don't care how busy you are. There's no excuse to miss it." She playfully pointed her finger at him. "I'll be right there," he laughed. The sun began to set and the sky darkened. All the fairies in the half-circle nodded to one another. "It's time," Esmeralda said. "Fairy Godmother, if you will please create a portal for our travelers for the last time." The fairy godmother reluctantly nodded. She stood in front of the council, and they joined hands behind her. The wind began to pick up and circled around them as their spell began, blowing the petals of the pear blossoms around like a blizzard. The fairy godmother waved her crystal wand and cracked it like a whip. A large tear appeared in the air, as if the worlds had been ripped at the seam. Everyone stared at it in awe. Connor could see the living room of the rental house on the other side of it. "It's done," the fairy godmother said, and turned back to the other fairies. "As soon as the portal closes, the gateway will be closed forever." The top and the bottom of the portal began retracting inward, and the seam between the two worlds started closing for good. Charlotte and Bob joined Connor and the other woman in the center, but Alex stayed behind by the fairies. "Alex, come on, let's go," Connor called to his sister. Alex didn't move. For the first time, Connor noticed she wasn't wearing her normal clothes. Instead, she wore a bright blue robe that sparkled like a night sky, just like her grandmother's. A headband made of the same white flowers their grandmother wore was in Alex's hair, and she held a long crystal wand, also just like their grandmother's. "Alex, why are you dressed like that?" Connor asked. Alex's eyes welled up instantly. She looked from her mother to her grandmother for support and took a deep breath before breaking the news to him. "Because I'm staying," Alex said. Connor felt like he had been kicked in the stomach. "You're what?" he said. Alex had known this would be one of the most difficult moments of her life, but she never could have imagined it was going to be this hard. "I was staying here with Grandma," Alex said. "I was going to tell you this morning, but you were gone by the time I woke up." Connor couldn't believe what he was hearing. He didn't want to believe it. He turned to his mother, hoping she would talk sense into his sister. "Mom, tell Alex she's crazy if she thinks she's staying here," he said, but his mother didn't immediately reprimand her like he was expecting. She just gazed at Alex with large, watery eyes. "She's telling the truth, Connor," Charlotte said. Connor looked back and forth between them, shaking his head. "No, this can't be real," he said to himself. "Why would you let her do something like that?" Charlotte placed a hand on her son's shoulder. "One day, when you have kids, Connor, you'll discover that your biggest fear is not always making good decisions for your children. And while I know I'll always regret the decision to let her stay, I'll always know it was the right decision," she said. "You know as much as I do that your sister belongs here." Connor felt like he had been ambushed. He looked to his grandmother, but there was no sign of an alternative answer in her eyes. "Alex, what about school?" Connor said. "What about graduation? What about college? What about starting families of her own someday? Are you just going to throw all those things away?" Alex wiped the tears from her face, even though they were quickly replaced with fresh streams. "There's nothing you're going to say now or in a year that I wouldn't have thought about 100 times. Alex said, "This isn't easy for me, Connor, but I know it's what I have to do." "You mean you've been planning this?" Connor said. He was so angry she had even considered something so drastic without telling him. "I thought about it every day since we got back the first time," Alex said. "I never thought the conditions would be so severe, but it was even in the Snow Queen's prophecy. We just didn't recognize it. Of the 4 travelers, 1 will not return. She was talking about you, me, Mom, and Bob. We were the 4 travelers, not the ones aboard the Granny." "You're gonna regret this," Connor said. "One day you're gonna look back and wish you hadn't left me and Mom." "No, I won't," Alex said, "because I couldn't live without this world now that I know how much it offers me." Connor felt like he was in a nightmare. "Alex, I've never been anywhere without you my entire life." Connor said. "We can't live worlds apart." "Don't you get it, Connor?" Alex said. "We were always meant to live worlds apart. Magic chose us to bridge between the 2 worlds. It's the reason there are 2 of us. I was meant to stay here and succeed Grandma in magic, and you were meant to go to the other world and continue her storytelling. Do you think it's just a coincidence that you turned out to be such a good writer?" Every fiber of his being wanted to argue with her. Every inch of him wanted to reject what she was telling him. But something about seeing his sister among the fairies made him feel like everything was right in the world, even though his was crashing around him. Alex stepped towards him and gave him the biggest hug she had ever given him. "We'll always be together, Connor," Alex said, "in our hearts and in your stories. Every time you pen another story about our adventures in the land of stories, I'll be right there with you. And when that isn't enough, we can always see each other in the mirrors." Esmeralda was the only one eyeing the portal. "The gateway is closing," she said. "You have to leave soon before you're all trapped in our world." For every tear that rolled down Connor's face, there was a dozen he fought back. He knew there was no going back now. Alex had made up her mind. There were so many things to say and not enough time to say it. Connor made sure to make his final moments with his sister count and say the only thing that mattered. "I love you, Alex," he said and hugged her. "I love you too, Connor," she said and hugged him back. They could both feel each other's tears on the back of their necks. One by one, Lady Iris, Rosemary, Petunia, and Bob stepped through the seam between worlds and disappeared. Charlotte gave Alex one last hug before stepping through it, and Connor followed her. He watched his sister through the seam as it slowly closed, and the fairy tale world vanished before his eyes. They were now dimensions apart, yet both the twins were finally home. Alex was right. Connor could still feel her in his heart. However, underneath the pain of saying goodbye was a lingering certainty that their goodbye wouldn't last forever. Despite what the fairies told him, Connor knew in his heart that his and Alex's story was far from over.